Okay.
Okay. I love that we have such a great combination of really experienced foster parents and we have some newer ones. I love that combination. So, my name's Camille Hereth. I'm a counselor. I'm going to explain my experience with the foster care system and then get into the more like official introduction on paper. But I was a foster parent for 5 years. I have done BRS case management. I have done family preservation services. I've taught an evidence-based parenting program for almost 15 years to families involved with foster care, CPS, and post-adoptive. I was a foster home licensor for a number of years. I absolutely loved doing that. Um, and now I own an agency where we have a contract with CPS or with DCYF, I should say, and we provide a lot of services to the foster parents, kinship parents, the families involved with CPS and again, post-adoptive. So our topic tonight is compassion fatigue and burnout. Um, my approach when I teach workshops is I do actually read the slides because I know that some people, I'm just sensitive to the fact that some people do better at listening, some people do better at reading. Um, and I just want to kind of honor where everyone's at. So, like I said, I've been a counselor for about a decade, working primarily with social services, women and families. I've had years of training in trauma-informed care and how stress impacts family function as well as individuals. In my years of working as a counselor, I have experienced compassion fatigue myself and have learned from that personal experience what does and does not work to prevent it and also recover from it. And that's why I'm such a passionate person about this. This is a topic that I think is really important. And I'm just so glad that you're all here to learn more about it. And I loved hearing one of the one of you mentioned that you're trauma informed and that you know what that means. That's great to hear. So here's what we're going to be going over today. First, we're going to identify what is compassion fatigue, burnout, and secondary trauma. They're actually each a little bit different. A lot of people don't know that. We're going to be, I'm going to be sharing a test where you can kind of gauge where you're at. We're going to talk about what does stress do internally to our bodies. Talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's going to be another worksheet we're going to do together, a couple more worksheets we're going to do together, and then talk about when to reach out for professional help if you're identifying that this is something that you are struggling with. And then we'll have some good discussion. So I would first love to hear, and I welcome any and all engagement. If you have a comment, go ahead and raise your hand or just put it down in the chat section. Just keep in mind that this is recorded. So if you want to maintain your privacy, the chat will be the best option. If it's something I know I'm going to get to later in the slides, and I'm going to just let you know that we'll get to that in a little bit, but I'll still check in with you at the end. So I would love to hear if anyone has any, just right off the bat, thoughts on what do you think is the difference between compassion, fatigue, burnout, and secondary trauma? Do you think there's a difference between those three things? And again, you can just mention in the chat section. No guesses yet? That's okay too. So let's get into it. So compassion fatigue is a state of tension and heightened arousal. It has a rapid onset. It can be felt after even the first experience of absorbing a traumatic information. So that's just like quick onset. Doesn't need to build over time, and you have a really strong visceral body reaction to it. There's actually a medical diagnosis. And the Webster Dictionary says the physical and mental exhaustion and emotional withdrawal experienced by those who care for sick or traumatized people over an extended period of time. So, and then there's apathy or indifference towards the suffering of others as a result of overexposure to tragic news stories and images, the subsequent, request for assistance. So this is kind of what it starts to feel like and look like, and we're going to talk a lot more about that too. But this is that indicator of, oh gosh, this is maybe going on. So historically, compassion fatigue has happened to those who are identified as the helper since COVID. One of the things in the counseling world and the professional world is that we've noticed that um, almost everybody to some extent experienced compassion fatigue throughout the pandemic and subsequently afterwards, kind of the outcomes of that. And I would say the same is true for the foster care industry and caregivers because there's that repeated type of exposure that you have. And again, we'll talk more about what does that look like and feel like in the body. So then we want to look at what's burnout. So burnout is something that happens more over time to work-related events. And in your instance, it can also be from caregiver-related events. It's caused by everyday stress, dealing with insurance companies, making treatment choices, dealing with case managers, social workers, your licensor. It results from taking on the emotional burden of a patient's agony. So just really feeling like what's going on. Apathy or indifference again towards those suffering is again going to be another um, indicator that this might be going on. And again, since COVID is arguable that a lot of people have experienced this as well, or the not. Whereas before it was oftentimes the caregivers, the first responders, the quote unquote helpers, teachers, things like that. First, firefighters, police officers, things like that. And then we want to look at what is vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma, it's also known as secondary trauma, is the effects compassion fatigue has on us as a person. It happens from indirect exposure to a traumatic event where you're exposed to other people's traumatic events as a result of the work you're doing or the caregiving you're providing. This is different than PTSD, which is a result of being the primary person the event happens to. So in secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, it's not something that's happened directly to you. It's something you've witnessed. So a good example of it is when you're watching the news and you see something deeply disturbing to you. The news is the second greatest source of secondary trauma. And we saw this during the pandemic. I think we're seeing it right now with what's going on in Israel. Like there's just flash of like moments in front of you that you're just like, oh, I can't unsee that. And that maybe affected you very deeply. So even something that quick, that one thing can cause that secondary trauma. It doesn't have to happen over time. It can just be that one present moment. So um, I'm curious if anyone has any examples of secondary trauma that you might experience or where you would experience secondary trauma being a caregiver. I can think of a few, but if you guys can think of any. Oh, we've got hearing a foster child story. Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of. Yeah. Yeah. So as the owner of an agency that provides these services to these families, every time we get a referral in, I have to read through it and then determine what service they need, what staff members are going to. And yeah, hearing those stories can be really, really difficult. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Anniversary dates as well, like when the child leaves your home and then you don't even really think about it until a day pops up and then you're like, oh, I wonder how so-and-so is doing. So it's not even like watching the news or having anything real traumatic on. It's just the brain remembering.
Yeah, Louis, I'm glad you mentioned that one because that's an intangible one, whereas reading something is tangible. The example someone else gave of hearing the story is intangible. So we can have both. We can have something we see, something we read, just something we remember. Yeah, absolutely. Someone shared another one. When I don't know what will happen next or where or when the child will have to move, and neither does the child. Yeah, that can absolutely be secondary trauma. And it creates that same feeling in our bodies, Um, bio parents learning their history and trauma. Yeah, that's a huge one. It's really difficult. And again, you can't, and once you hear it, you can't unhear it. So it's very clear. We all have those moments where we're like, oh, I wish I could unhear that or unknow that, and you can't. Yeah, yeah, a few people agree about that one. Yep. Yeah, so that's the difference between the three, although they can present very, very similarly. So here's what happens in the compassion fatigue process. Um, and you guys just gave some good examples of how it starts. Exposure to the suffering, exposure to the child's story, the parent's story. And then we have empathy and we have concern. And then that moves into we have an empathetic response. So we're feeling that in our body. We're like, oh my gosh, that's so sad. That's so horrible. Um, and then we can either detach or have a sense of satisfaction of like, okay, I accept that I'm moving forward. And then we have residual compassion stress where it's like, oh, I can't unknow that. That's really weighing on my mind. You know, you start to kind of ruminate on whatever it is that you learned, whatever you heard, whatever you saw. And then we start to have some traumatic memories about whatever it is that we heard, whatever it is that we saw. Um, Also parallel at the same time, we're going to start to potentially experience prolonged exposure to suffering. Um, like continuing to see the story unfold. The example that was given of don't know when a child's going to go back to their bio parents. You know, we're continuing to have to be exposed to that thing that's activating us. And then when we have a lot of pressure of other demands on top of us, it really just compounds those feelings of stress, which heightens our arousal and response to that stressful, traumatic thing we heard or saw. And we'll get into a little bit more about what that looks like. So all these things, it's a process and it can happen really fast or over time, but um, this is really that process that then lands us in compassion fatigue. So here's some really common indicators of compassion fatigue and burnout. And I want to first recognize before we get through this list that these indicators can also be indicators of other things. So we want to keep in mind, like, was there a triggering event? Was there a traumatic event? Has there been things I've had to see over and over again that are really weighing on me? You know, so you have to check in with yourself about this. And this is not a full list by any means, but pretty typical symptoms are going to be fatigue, chronic illness, cynicism, irritability, reduced productivity, feelings of hopelessness, anger, despair, sadness, feelings of re-experiencing the event, like I was mentioning before, ruminating on it, which is where you just can't seem to stop thinking about it, sleep disturbances, anxiety, would also add depression, avoidance of people or activities that you would typically otherwise enjoy. So it's avoidance, but in a new way that's not typical for you. Persistent anger and sadness. I would say agitation is another one. Lowered libido, heightened state of alertness, just that fight or flight feeling, and then feelings of despair regarding work or the caregiving that you're doing. And so one of the areas I specialize in as a counselor is treating people that have compassion fatigue and burnout. And a lot of times, I would say most of the time, actually, the people I'm working with, they have all of these things, but they're not able to identify there's been, it's a compassion fatigue or burnout. That's not the reason. So it can be right in front of you and also really hard to see, especially if you've been doing the thing for a very long time that has onset the compassion fatigue or burnout, and you've really normalized a lot of these feelings. I see that happen quite a bit. I work with a lot of nurses. It's really common with nurses. So while compassion fatigue and burnout can stem from being a caregiver, the impact can far reach outside of this work into our personal lives. So our personal lives might not be the thing that onsets it, but it just bleeds out into everything and it starts to affect everything. Maybe for a while people can compartmentalize, but over time that gets really difficult to do the further we get into it. So having personal challenges that remind a person of a traumatic experience that onset the compassion fatigue or increases the symptoms of compassion fatigue or burnout can compound the effects to prolong the symptoms. Examples of things that can decrease someone's distress tolerance, especially while experiencing compassion fatigue or burnout, are a change in health of a family member, death of a loved one, change in work hours or conditions, change in recreational activity. So just your ability to really get out there, maybe de-stress and decompress, change in social activity, change in financial state, change in work responsibilities. So, and when I mentioned earlier, the distress tolerance, your distress tolerance is your ability to manage stress and cope in a positive way. And so if we're experiencing these things, it typically is going to really heighten that compassion fatigue or burnout and the symptoms that we saw previously. And this is by no means a full comprehensive list. There's a lot of other things that can contribute to decreasing your distress tolerance. And then, of course, we want to pay attention to the fact that there's good stress and there's bad stress, right? So if we look at what is good stress, so if we have a new baby, an interview for a new job, preparing for some kind of relay race, 5K, 10K marathon, whatever, something like that, your kid's first day of school, preparing for a presentation like this one, planning for a wedding, like that's all good stress. And we're still going to feel the effects of that. And then we have the not so good stress. So examples of that are a family death, chronic illness, financial strain, too much to do, not enough time, relationship struggles, constant change to our environment. I want to highlight that a lot of the things on this list, hopefully not a death, but a lot of these things on our list can really stem from being a caregiver. It is financially burdensome at times. We could potentially be a foster parent for a child that has chronic illness. That's a medically fragile child. I know because I was a foster parent that a lot of the time, especially those of you doing BRS, there's so many appointments, there's so many things to get to that can be exhausting. And then depending on how many kids you have in the home. And that stress can be burdensome on your relationship with your partner if you have bio kids in the home, or if you have already adopted kids in the home and you've got new foster kids in the home, or whatever kinds of kids in the home. That can certainly cause some strain on relationships. And then, of course, having new kids in our home is going to be a change to our environment. And yeah, then I know the world of licensing, where sometimes maybe a licensor will come through and tell you new safety plans you have to make up. And that's stressful. You know, that's never fun to have to do those changes. So, and we can have some life events that fit under both categories, like having a new placement. I heard someone say they got a baby. It's a good stress. And there's a lot of this stuff that can come with it too. So we really can be experiencing both at the same time. A couple things to keep in mind is when our body is under stress, it affects different hormones and neurotransmitters and things in our body. Cortisol, dopamine, and serotonin all play an important role in how our body handles stress, and we're going to go into just a little bit how that looks. So first we want to look at cortisol. It's a stress hormone, and our body develops it in the adrenal glands, which is next to our kidneys. So when you wake up, exercise, face a stressful event, your pituitary gland reacts. It sends a signal to your adrenal glands to produce the right amount of cortisol. It's a perfectly worked system. It works with except when we're under chronic stress. And when we're under chronic stress, that cortisol keeps dumping and dumping and dumping and dumping and dumping. So our cortisol works with certain parts of your brain to control your mood, your motivation, and fear, your fight or flight response. It manages how your body uses carbohydrates, fats, proteins, keeps inflammation down, regulates your blood pressure, increases your blood sugar, controls your sleep and wake cycle, boosts energy so you can handle stress and restore balance after the stressful period is over. So people that are under constant stress, that inflammation is going to build up in the body. They're going to start to gain weight, typically in the belly areas where it's going to start first. That's where our body first stores that stress fat. Uh, we're going to start to crave a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of fatty foods. People that have too much cortisol in their body often get hungry more often, because their blood sugars can't regulate, and so they can't wait between meals. It starts to become a lot harder to regulate your mood, to be motivated to do things. It affects your sleep cycles. And so a lot of times when their cortisol cycle is off, your circadian rhythm, your sleep cycle gets off. And so a lot of times what that'll look like is difficulty falling asleep. People waking between like 3 and 4 a.m. just kind of startled awake and their heart racing really fast. So cortisol just plays a huge role in our bodies if we're under constant chronic stress. And then what that could eventually lead to is something called adrenal fatigue, where your body just starts to shut down and say, nope, I can't, I can't, I can't, I can't. We've overproduced. It's like beyond exhaustion. So, and then we want to consider serotonin. So it's a chemical, aka neurotransmitter, that helps brain and nervous system cells communicate. Its main function is to stabilize your mood as well as your feelings of happiness and well-being. So if you don't have enough of this, then it can potentially look like depression. But it really just helps kind of keep things in balance. And then we want to look at dopamine. So it's also a neurotransmitter in your body, but it also acts as a hormone, which is kind of a newer thing that we've learned in science. It has a lot of functions, but the most important one, as we consider compassion fatigue and burnout, is that it helps you feel pleasure, joy, and reward with things. So if we consider a kiddo that has low dopamine or low serotonin, how might that affect their function or their behavior when they're with you in your home? How would that look? And Luann gave me a little clue. They went over this a little bit in the TBRI training if you guys have taken that, which I have as well. Any thoughts?
I would think somewhat of a flat affect. Looking at dopamine with BRS teens, there's a push to use drugs because of lack of pleasure, joy, reward, looking for something that's stimulating and that will bring that missing piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's medications that will help those neurotransmitters connect the way they need to and try to basically create the effect of dopamine, although it's not naturally derived. So, yep, they're going to present as a flat affect, not show a lot of emotion, not going to find pleasure from things other children, same age peers might.
I'm thinking more of kids that use methamphetamine rather than prescription medications. I mean, illegal drugs that can help
Okay.
you. Yeah. Just personal experience I've had with teens, BRS teens. That seems to be one that they seek.
Yeah, if they're constantly living down here in the dopamine world and their cortisol has just been overdumped, we know that that affects mood, and they just want to feel a little bit better. Those drugs are going to feel pretty good. It's going to give them that dopamine effect. And yeah, it creates that feel good, that reward. They get that instantaneous reward when they do that drug. Yep. And we also know, long term that increases that anxiety and depression. But they don't know that, or if they know that, they just want to feel better. And then what about, someone else give another example? Sadness, anger. Yeah. yeah, they're going to present as sad a lot of the time or really angry and agitated because again, they're like their moods aren't balanced. They don't have what they need to seek joy, experience joy. Yeah. Yeah. So all of these play really closely together. Um, yeah. So then we want to think about what does it feel like in the body? And I want you to think about the kids, but also you as adults. Um, Kids can absolutely have compassion fatigue and burnout. I mean, think about the chronic exposure to trauma potentially some of these kids have had. So if you notice any of these things that you are noticing in these kids, you know, it's possible they've definitely had some trauma exposure. So headaches, really, really common to get those tension headaches for people. Butterflies in the stomach, tension in the neck, tension or pain in the cervix. This is one that a lot of people don't know. But a lot of women store stress in their cervix. And so they think, oh, it hurts to have intercourse. It's actually stress that's stored there and it stores over time. Sweaty palms, racing heart, dizzy or lightheaded, agitated, clenching jaw. A lot of people will clench their jaw in their sleep and then they'll wake up and they'll be kind of sore in here. Just not sleeping well, having a hard time falling asleep and or staying asleep or having nightmares. We're not really addressing PTSD today, but PTSD oftentimes has come with nightmares and then feeling tired all the time. And that's because our body is exhausted from that constant fight or flight. And potentially our cortisol has just been shot through the roof and our body is just done. Can you guys think of any other symptoms of stress that you've noticed in your body or you've heard other people mention before? This is certainly not an all-inclusive list. And while you're thinking of some ideas, let's just kind of look at these pictures because we can kind of see what's maybe going on here. So this mom, where might she be storing stress in her body? If you've got little ones that are always on your hip, you could have lower back pain. That's certainly an area a lot of people experience stress is in their lower back. She could be getting a sore neck from just having to multitask like she's doing right now, and a headache from kids constantly screaming at her, which little ones do, which they're developmentally driven to do. Nothing wrong with them. If we look at this lady right here, it looks like, yeah, she might definitely have a headache. A lot of people feel it in their temples, excuse me, or across their eyebrows. If we look at this gentleman, he just looks overwhelmed. So if I was him, I would maybe, yeah, have that headache again, maybe feel really lightheaded, like just so overwhelmed because the baby's been crying because maybe the baby was born drug affected. And if you've had a baby in your home born drug affected, a lot of the time, the first while, depending on the amount of exposure they had, they cry. They can cry a lot and just be really hard to soothe, overstimulated very easily by lights and sounds and touches. So he could be so anxious ridden that he's maybe seeing stars right now. And maybe his jaw is really clenched because he's so stressed because this baby won't stop crying. Yeah, so it can look and feel like a lot of different things. Someone mentioned difficulty concentrating. Yeah, it can be really hard to concentrate when you're under chronic stress. Yeah. So I want everyone to just take a minute and just, tune into your body. What is your forehead feeling like? What is the back of your neck, your jaw? Are your teeth touching? Is the tongue on the top of your roof or the roof of your mouth? How are your shoulders? Are they pressed down? Are they really high up? How's your armpits? Do you have puddles in your armpits or are they dry? Your hands, are they clammy and wet? Are they dry? Your stomach, does it feel uneasy? Do you feel hunger? paying attention to your joints. Do any of your joints feel sore? Maybe you have some inflammation in your joints from stress. Just really paying attention to what is it feeling like in the body to have stress. So there's a direct correlation between what you feel in your body and the emotion that relates to it, and that's called the somatic response. So every single emotion has a physical response in our body. And actually, when we teach the evidence-based parenting classes, we teach the parents how to teach the kids, how does it feel in your body? Because kids can identify, oh, I have butterflies in my stomach way sooner than they can use the words to say, I'm really angry because da 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 da. So there's emotional intelligence and then there's body intelligence where we're getting in touch with what emotions is our body telling us. And I love this emotion wheel because it gives you so many emotions, but then it also tells you what kind of somatic response could pair with that emotion. So if we look at the center, there's these root emotions. The root emotions are fear, anger, disgust, sad, happy, surprised. And if we go with the surprised example, it's the easiest for me to read. I'll have to turn my neck the most. Then some off branches of that are shock, confusion, awe, and excitement. Okay. And then what does that look like in the body? Well, it can look like being jumpy, sweaty palms, breathless, speechless, jaw drop, eyebrows up, kind of electrified, just woo, really lots of energy stored in our bodies, and jumpy. And some of these somatic responses can go in lots of different categories, right? So, yeah, this is a really good exercise to first learn to identify what is the emotion and find a word for it. Typical adults can only list 6 emotions, even though there's dozens and dozens and dozens of emotions. But that's okay, because if we can at least know kind of these root emotions, then we can figure out, oh, that's why I'm feeling this way. One thing that's kind of interesting to know is that we only have an emotion for 16 to 19 seconds. Anything beyond that is just the body's response to it. The emotion lies in our brain for 16 to 19 seconds. And then it's really our body that perpetuates that emotion. And so the more we can learn to tap into how is this feeling in my body and then addressing it through the body, the quicker we can get control of our emotions, which I think is really fascinating. So in my line of work with counseling, that's a lot of my approach is helping people get in touch with their bodies and then learning to control those emotions through the body. Fascinating stuff, huh? I think so. So, and then we want to consider what is the stress doing internally inside your body where you can't necessarily see. So chronic stress can increase chances of a cardiac event. So heart attack, I can't think of any more off the top of my head, but any kind of disease associated with our hearts. Chronic stress causes let me go back to that. So heart attacks are the #1 killers, one of the top 7 killers of firefighters and police officers. And there's a direct correlation to that because of that chronic stress that they're under, what they constantly see and do. Chronic stress causes increased cortisol levels in the body, which can lead to weight gain, predominantly in the belly area, like we mentioned before. So again, like that's something going on internally. Over time, we are going to see it because we're going to have inflammation. We're going to gain that weight. Joints are going to be sore, things like that. Chronic stress can also lead to hair loss. If we had to have a sudden onset traumatic event, about six weeks later to 12 weeks later, we can potentially lose like up to half of our hair. Chronic stress can lower your immune function. So just starting to notice like you're sick all the time, your body is just no longer working optimally. Chronic stress can impact sleep, which has a whole host of negative health effects. I'm sure all of you have heard about the importance of sleep. And so just kind of what we mentioned earlier too about It can make it difficult to fall asleep or stay asleep or have those nightmares. And then chronic stress can lead to or worsen mood disorders. So if someone already has, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, any mental health disorders, that onset of stress and the increase of stress really can heighten those disorders and can also onset for the first time some of these mood disorders. Let me check the chat section real quick. It is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. Stress is, yes. Yeah, because when that cortisol is constantly dumping into the system, when we get too much of it in our system, it makes it harder for our body to regulate and metabolize the glucose. And so it really starts to store up, and then our body can't metabolize it the way it needs to. And that's when and why the weight gain happens. And then, yeah, it can absolutely lead to type 2 diabetes. I just heard a statistic, something like 93% of Americans are pre-diabetic, and it's a pretty stressful society we're living in America right now, I think. So it's not surprising to hear that, but yeah, that was a great point. Now, the good news, though, is this is reversible. All of this is reversible and avoidable. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a stress, assessment. Let me find the chat section. There it is. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Luann, for doing that. So Luann just added to the chat section the self-care assessment. Everyone can pull that up. I'm going to also pull it up on my screen if you're like on a phone or something and it's just hard to switch from Zoom to looking at that document. So give me a minute. Come on, I'm having a hard time getting it up. Here we go. Okay. So this is our self-care assessment. So I'm gonna set a timer for, I think we'll do 5 minutes to give everybody a chance to look through this. And just if you can write down your answers and then you can get a score at the end. And then we can talk about what the results mean. But so we've got a couple different categories. We've got physical self-care, psychological self-care, emotional self-care, spiritual self-care, relationship self-care, workplace or professional self-care, and then just how you feel about your overall balance. And you're going to score it, like it says at the top, a 0 to 3. 3 being you think you do this really well, and 0 meaning I've never done this before. And you can just leave it blank if it's something that you've never thought of. But try to give it a number. And then at the end, yeah, we'll kind of talk about the score. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes.
For those that don't have it on their screen, can you put yours where they can read it?
Oh, can you not see that?
Not the whole sheet at one time.
Oh, how do I do that? Let me see if I can minimize this. I don't know how to make it smaller.
If you do the magnifying glass, I think. No.
In the bottom right corner, there's a magnifying glass with a minus
Oh,
sign.
thank you.
Thank you. We should have asked Mandy to begin with.
Problem.
You might want to do just one page at a time, though.
What are you doing?
I'll just scroll it down a little bit. And this is the end. There's no more after that. Okay. So, if anyone wants to share anything that was surprising to them, I would love to hear it. Sometimes people will see a little bit in each category. Sometimes people will see that there's a few categories or one category they're really good at, and they had maybe never thought about doing self-care in other areas, like taking a workplace self-care approach. So yeah, it's just kind of bringing to light where are you with your self-care and the moments you're taking to resource yourself and being mindful of it. And so it's helpful, it can be helpful to maybe write on the margins or highlight some of the ones that you want to try to do more of or that you haven't thought of before and you think that sounds like a good idea. But just really taking stock of where you're at with this. Do I need to be doing more? How do I work that into my life? And we'll talk more about that. But it's just a good reflective tool I like to use. So going back to, can you all see that? Yeah. All right. So moving on, then we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So first we have physiological needs that everyone has. Breathing, food, water, shelter, clothing, sleep. So most kids that have come into care were missing at least one of these things. They weren't in a safe home, so they didn't get good sleep. They maybe did not have access, maybe they had clothes, but maybe not clean clothes or clothes that fit, or maybe we're homeless living on the streets, or we're in a home that didn't have food or water, or excuse me, water or electricity. There's water there, food insecure, and breathing is a basic need everyone has. And then we look at safety and security. So our health, our employment, property, family and social ability. So these are all things that can be affected by being a caregiver. Luann, it looks like there's someone that wants in. Do you want me to let him in? Yeah? Okay. So yeah, so if we don't have these things met, we can't move further up our needs list. And so if we're thinking about the kids, if they have health, and not just health, but also school, like access to a good education system, having their needs met in the school. So if they have learning disabilities, learning challenges, behavior challenges that have impact their ability to function well in school, that's going to fit into safety and security. And then we move up to, and I want to highlight too, during the pandemic, and I mention it because we're still feeling the effects of it for a lot of families. So much of this was threatened for everybody. So that's I think impactful to really think about. But then we move into love and belonging, our friendships, our family, intimacy, sense of connection. So it's really hard to access these things if we don't have these basic needs met. And then we're working on things that bring us confidence, sense of achievement, respect for others because we feel fulfilled ourselves, and so we can have that. And the need to just really explore who we are as a unique individual, because we have the time and the space to do that for ourselves because these needs are being met. And then we come to self-actualization, where we're thinking of a lot of those higher level things like morality, creativity, spontaneity, acceptance, experiencing purpose, meaning in our lives, really seeing our inner potential. And if, kids and adults, all this relates to all human beings. And so if we have some basic things down here being met, it's hard to meet all of our needs as a person. So I think it's helpful to really reflect on what does this look like in the kids, and then also how does this look like for us, and how can we model all of this if we're not meeting this down here. So I'm wondering if you guys can think about how can being a caregiver affect your stress and your ability to access all of your hierarchy of needs. And also thinking about, if you're in survival mode with your safety and security, what do you need to do to be able to move further up, to move into more joy, more pleasure, more self-fulfilling activities in your life? It's really hard to move into this space if you're not even meeting this space down here. So, but we'll definitely talk about some tools tonight about how to do that for yourself. Okay, so then we want to wear stresses versus resourcing. So Luann, can you plug in the stressors versus resourcing list? Thank you. Hold on. All right, so this is what this looks like. And then in the interest of time, we're just going to kind of run through this. But we really want to think about, what are our stressors? They tend to be those bigger items. The pandemic was an example, having a placement is an example, and this is an editable document. Having a child placed in your home is an example. You know, if you have a partner that has a chronic illness, that could be an example. You know, the more, hopefully you don't have more than like 2 over here, but some people can have 5 and 6. The more you have over here, the more you really want to be adding in over here to offset that. Taking supplements, going for a walk. So, next we're going to look at how to implement some of that stuff. So the stressors, you guys can see this, right? The slides, back to the slides. Yeah. Okay. So the stressors are things that are negatively affecting your function with real-time effects. Those side effects we talked about earlier. And resourcing, like I mentioned, should be bigger. The bigger the stressor, the more resourcing we need to do. To make this achievable, think of small things throughout the day you can do to focus on the mind, body, and soul and sustainable support for psychological care.
Are you back
And
to
then
your
we're
slides or are you still on the resource sheet?
oh, you can, I was wondering if you could see you couldn't see the slide, sorry.
That's okay.
Thanks for saying something. Okay. So then we're gonna look at this. Oh yeah, we just looked at that. Stressors versus resourcing list. And here's some different examples of things. The real principle here is to just be really mindful with when you're adding these things in, because when we're stressed, when we're overwhelmed, when we're in compassion, fatigue, and burnout, everything can feel overwhelming and unachievable. And so it's really about our mindset. So, you know, having things in your home that bring you joy, like having a lot of plants in your home. I love canning. And so canning is something. Being outside in nature, doing little eye patch things, meditating, talking to a friend, taking supplements, prayer, painting, doing something creative, making yourself some smoothies or something good for you, exercising, listening to a podcast, connecting with a friend, reading, going to therapy, seeing a counselor, getting some massage done, you know, the chakra system, whatever your belief system is, getting some energy work done. This is why I had that silly picture of me in the beginning, you know, just taking some time to do something nice for yourself. So, a lot of times self-care is touted as just this big thing, you know, and really what makes it achievable is having a lot of little things throughout the day and having that presence of mind of thinking to yourself, okay, I'm taking these supplements right now so I can nourish and support my body. Okay, I'm listening to this podcast right now to have something to think about that's positive to offset all of these worrying thoughts I'm having right now. So certainly not a comprehensive list. If you guys can think of anything else, I would love to see it in the chat section. Using your resourcing tools with intention matters. I can talk all day about using these things and you can numbly go through the motions of doing them, which leads to them feeling like a chore and has much less benefit. And that's not what we want. This can also be the difference between self-soothing and self-care. So self-soothing is you're not doing it with intention, and self-care is you're having that intention of I'm taking care of myself right now. So we don't want to use them all at once. Be intentional about small achievable resourcing throughout the day. Think about what part of yourself that resourcing is fueling, your mind, body, or soul, or more than one at once. While what will work one day may not the next. That's why it's good to have a lot of things on your resourcing list and then pulling from what feels achievable from day to day. If you're a really strong creature of habit, you can take your Myers-Briggs to find out about that. That may be a little bit different. Some people are so habit-based that they like to have that routine of the same thing every day, and that's okay too. So when you're using your self-care resourcing, use kind language with yourself. Like, I'm drinking this smoothie to help nourish my body because it does such a great job taking care of me. And I would recommend really like taking the time to fill this out and then put it up on the wall somewhere that you can reference often. Something that's helpful with adding things, I just noticed that we're running low on time. I went too slow, so I'm trying to pick it up. Something to help implement some of this stuff is what we call habit stacking. And this helps get further up in our Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this is how we add some of that stuff into the day in an effective way. So you brush your teeth every day. And then maybe while you're brushing your teeth, you're going to listen to a 5-minute uplifting podcast. And then maybe while that's going on, you're also going to put some little eye patches on. And then you're also going to maybe have a diffuser going with some uplifting essential oils, something citrusy or lavender or something like that. So that's an example of what habit stacking is like and how we can try to easily add some stuff in without it feeling too overwhelming. But then we get to a point where maybe we need some professional help and we can't pull ourselves out of this. So when to do that, that's when you're noticing that you're numbing out more often than not or disassociating throughout the day. When you have too little or no desire to do the things you normally would enjoy. When intrusive thoughts or feelings are getting in the way of having good hygiene habits and affecting your relationships. When you have depression, a shower feels really hard to do, which is different than I can't get to a shower because I have littles in the house. It's like that feels like too much work. When you're having thoughts of harming yourself or others, and when you feel isolated alone and you have no one to talk to, those are pretty good indicators it's time to reach out to some professional help. And then here's a few discussion questions. So what is one thing that was surprising to you in this presentation? Or was there anything surprising to you?
The connection between long-term stress and heart issues, heart attacks.
Yeah, it's a pretty big one. And it's rooted in a lot of data, a lot of research. I mean, that's a lot of facts there. Yeah. Someone said it's felt in the body. Good. Glad that was helpful.
I had kind of a light bulb moment with that one list of the self-care where it mentions doing activities where you're not the expert or not in charge. Because I do have activities that I really thought were self-care, and it's like, I don't think I'm getting as much out of those as I thought I was.
Yeah.
Like grocery shopping was on my self-care list.
Okay. That's a good reflection. Yeah. Well, and a lot of people, there's two different kinds of relaxing. There's relaxing where your body is still, you're laying down, and then there's active relaxing, which is more comfortable for a lot of women. So you're sitting there folding laundry, no one's bothering you. You're getting something done, but you're feeling relaxed because you're getting something accomplished. I would say that grocery shopping is another form of active relaxation where you don't have the kids necessarily in tow, but you're still out there doing something. If it's fueling you, then I would say that's okay to have it on your list. And is there something that could serve you a little bit better you can replace it with? How do you think you could use the handouts for yourself again in the future? When would you maybe consider taking them out again and taking stock again? Looking for improvement. Someone said going over them quarterly just to reevaluate. Yeah.
I also added the other two handouts that you had.
Okay, thank you.
If you
Yeah,
want
we
to
kinda-
address those.
I will.
Okay.
When life starts to feel overwhelming. Yep. Yeah. And there's no right or wrong answer here. If you're someone who had very few things that you are doing for self-care, and you're identifying with a lot of those compassion fatigue and burnout symptoms, I would say you need to be evaluating pretty consistently, looking for, am I increasing? to do things to fill my cup up. You've all heard that analogy, I'm sure. You can't pour from an empty cup, right? And when you have kids in your care, you have to give so much of yourself. And so if you know that I'm pretty far down into E, I'm going to reevaluate every 2 weeks to see have I been able to add in at least one thing a day, 2 things a day, 3 things a day, and trying to assess for which areas would help you most. Maybe the spiritual category for self-care feels like I can't do that, or I don't want to do that, or I go to church every Sunday, I'm good, whatever that looks like for you. But you know, maybe the physical component would help you more to feel more resourced. And so you're going to really focus on just that one category. Don't feel like you have to have checks all the way down the list. Really pay attention to what is your body telling you it needs. Again, going back to that somatic response, that gives you a lot of information about where to prioritize resourcing yourself. I'm curious if anyone had any ideas about what they might do differently moving forward to resource themselves. Is there anything that really stood out to you that you were like, yeah, I really want to give that a try. That sounds really good.
Not anything like specific from the list, but I think going through this, a big thought that I have is I'm going to share the handouts with my spouse and kind of talk about some of this with him. I wish he was available to do this right now, because I think especially some of the partner things and leaning on each other for support instead of finding our own individual things would probably be useful.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear you say that. The last question I had was, how could you support someone else who has signs of compassion fatigue or burnout? And I said, maybe a partner, because that could be really good to help hold each other accountable. You know, if you each know what compassion fatigue or burnout looks like, and you can really support each other in trying to curb that or bring it to each other's attention. Like I mentioned before, a lot of the nurses I do counseling with, they're not aware, even though they have every single indicator. But that self-awareness can be really hard, especially when you have been functioning from the place of chronic stress for a long time, which is pretty common when you are working with the foster care system. It's certainly not a walk in the park. I'm going to share another resource that Luann added to the chat section. Can y'all see this? The professional quality of life skill. Yeah, you can see it, Luann. Okay. So this is an assessment that I use with my counseling clients, but you can absolutely just use it with yourself. This is what we use to assess if someone has compassion fatigue. And so there's a score of 1 to 5 in a lot of different categories. I'm happy and preoccupied with more than one person. I get satisfaction from being able to help people. I feel connected to others, startle or jump unexpectedly, feel invigorated after work with those I help. So that would be the placements that you have. I'm not as productive at work, and you're going to kind of adjust this a little bit to being a caregiver, but it would apply the same because I am losing sleep over traumatic experiences of a person I help. I think that I might have been affected by the traumatic stress of those I help. I feel trapped by my job as a helper. Because of my helping, I have felt on edge about various things. I like my work as a helper. I feel depressed because of the traumatic experiences of the people I help. I feel as though I'm experiencing the trauma of someone I help or have helped. I have beliefs that sustain me. I'm pleased with how I'm able to keep up with helping techniques and protocols, and so on and so forth. When someone's having compassion and fatigue and burnout, they're a helper because they want to be. People were typically called to do this work. And when we're experiencing compassion, fatigue, and burnout, you're not going to be necessarily experiencing that satisfaction that you know that you once did. I think about that I might have been affected by the traumatic stress of those I help. So if you're just constantly ruminating and worrying and worrying and worrying about the child, the situation, where they came from, and maybe you didn't you used to be able to hear it and then just let it go. So it's really noticing, like, is there changes here from where I was before? And this is another assessment that can be helpful to take. This is definitely more of like a quarterly thing. You're not going to have quick changes if you've got some things that you're scoring high on, maybe twice a year even. But this really helps you get a good feel and pulse for where you're at. In terms of, and then it gives you down at the bottom an actual number that tells you, yep, you're in burnout. Yep, you have secondary traumatic stress. Yeah, helps you score it down at the bottom. It's a really helpful tool. If you're scoring high on that, with the burnout, then I would recommend probably getting some professional help. Let's see, any more comments? Intentionally doing active relaxation. Yes, for some people, active relaxation works really well for them. You just have to check in. Like, I love how Ariana had mentioned, I thought that grocery shopping was self-care, but maybe it's not. Like, you just have to take that time and check in with yourself. Finding some time in the day to do something small that brings you joy is something that you might try to add in. I love that. Yeah, and again, that mindfulness piece is what's going to be really important. You know, looking for the joy and being aware, like, oh, this thing brings me joy. Like, you know, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, I was walking into the front of my house, and this big gust of wind came in, and I saw like the top of a dandelion flower like carry all the seeds away. I was like, oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. Like, that only happens in cartoons and stuff. That brought me joy, and I noticed it. And so depending on where your mind is at, it can be hard to notice those moments. So yeah, challenging yourself to look for them. And also thinking about, am I having more positive or negative thoughts in a day? And challenging yourself to notice when you're looking for that joy, is there a shift in where you're at with that balance? Any other thoughts? The last tool I'm going to share or show you guys go over with that Luann also added in the chat section is your maintenance self-care plan worksheet. I want to recognize that this is a lot easier said than done for a lot of people. Like, challenging yourself to do this is really hard. So don't feel like you have to start with all categories. Maybe just pick one and one thing. Also keeping in mind, the bigger the stressor, the more we need to offset it. But this can be another helpful worksheet to put up on your wall somewhere. So what's your current practice and what do you want to add in? If your current practice is nothing, that's fine. And you want to add in, current practice is I have more negative than positive thoughts in a day and I don't like it. And your new practice is I'm going to look for things that bring me joy at least 4 times a day. I want to offset that negative versus positive thought process. So yeah, just do what's realistic for you and achievable. It's more important to have it be achievable than to try to do everything and then you fail because it's too overwhelming. You don't have room in your life. So go back to our slides. And that is the end. I'm so glad that you all decided to be here and take the time. This was a presentation that was really for the caregivers and taking care of yourself. And I just want to honor all of you for taking the time to honor yourselves. So thank you.